Michigan, 2005. A cold case finally solved. 9-year-old Jacob Eli Monroe, a third-grade student with a love for dinosaurs and bedtime. Sketchbooks vanished after school one rainy autumn afternoon in his quiet neighborhood, outside Grand Rapids. His backpack was found near an abandoned culvert. No sign of a struggle, no witnesses. Days turned to years. Suspicion swirled, but evidence remained elusive. Families locked their doors. Detectives retired. Grief hardened. For nearly 2 decades, the case haunted a town, until a DNA match changed everything. A sudden arrest. A name no one expected, and a revelation that would send shockwaves through the community Jacob once called home. Before we begin, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. In 2005, Cedar Lake, Michigan, was the kind of town you only heard about in quiet family stories or saw in faded photo albums. Nestled between woodlands and long stretches of cornfields, it was the place where kids still played outside until the streetlights flickered on, and where neighbors exchanged holiday cookies over picket fences. The rhythm of life was slow, predictable, and comforting. 9-year-old Jacob Eli Monroe was part of that rhythm. A third-grade student at Hillview Elementary, Jacob was known to teachers and students alike for his boundless curiosity, his gentle demeanor, and the ever-present spiral-bound sketchbook he carried like a second backpack. Inside were page after page of dinosaurs, carefully drawn, labeled, shaded. From the towering Tyrannosaurus rex to the lesser-known iguanodon, Jacob could name them all, often quizzing his mom and sister as they shared dinner around the kitchen table. He lived in a modest beige ranch house on Oak Ridge Lane with his single mother, Rachel, and older sister Megan. Rachel worked night shifts as a nurse at a nearby hospital, while Megan, 15 at the time, balanced high school with helping raise her younger brother. The Monroes weren't wealthy, but their home was filled with warmth, laughter, and love. Jacob's room, painted light blue with glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling, was a shrine to everything prehistoric. Plastic dino figures lined the windowsill, posters of fossil dig sites on the walls, and piles of library books on paleontology scattered across the floor. He wasn't the kind of kid who got into trouble. Jacob obeyed rules, finished his homework early, and preferred drawing over television. During recess, he often sat beneath the big oak tree behind the school, scribbling sketches or reading dinosaur fact books. Some kids teased him, but Jacob didn't seem to mind. He was kind to everyone, even to those who weren't kind back. Rachel remembers one night vividly, just weeks before the disappearance, when Jacob climbed into her bed during a thunderstorm, clutching his sketchbook. "I drew a new one," he said, grinning. "It's a stegosaurus. He's not scared of anything." That was Jacob, always thinking of the world and creatures and courage, even if he didn't see those traits in himself. The town of Cedar Lake embraced him. Teachers described him as the heart of the class. At church, he helped collect hymnals. During library story time, Jacob often volunteered to read out loud, his soft voice full of emotion, always adding little details to the tales. His presence was one that made others feel calm, safe, seen, but as the leaves began to shift into autumn and the familiar chill of October crept through the trees, there was something else stirring in the background. Something no one noticed until it was too late. There were reports of a strange man seen near the school, of unfamiliar cars idling at odd hours. Nothing concrete, just murmurs in the wind. At home, Jacob seemed fine, chatting about a new dinosaur he'd learned about, preparing for the upcoming school costume day, and trying to convince Megan to help him build a cardboard volcano for science class. But the world he loved, the world of dinosaurs and childhood innocence, was already being edged out by a reality no one was ready for. Because just days later, on a quiet Wednesday, Jacob Eli Monroe would walk out of Hillview Elementary and vanish, without a sound, without a trace, and without a goodbye. What happened on the day Jacob disappeared? October 12, 2005 began like so many others in Cedar Lake, quiet, ordinary, and unremarkable. The kind of day no one would remember, until they did. Jacob Eli Monroe woke up early that Wednesday, excited about art class. He put on his favorite red windbreaker, the one with the slightly torn sleeve, and carefully packed his lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, crackers, and a juice box. He always brought the same thing. Routine was comforting to Jacob. Before heading out, he hugged his mom tightly and kissed her cheek. Rachel reminded him to come straight home after school. "Love you, kiddo," she said, not knowing it would be the last time she'd see his face. At Hillview Elementary, the day passed without incident. Jacob showed his latest dinosaur sketches to Miss Wilkins, his teacher, and gave a book report in front of the class. During recess, he played alone near the big oak tree, like always. One of his classmates, Daniel, later told police that Jacob had mentioned wanting to walk home that day, something he rarely did. Dismissal came. The buses loaded up, but Jacob didn't board his. Instead, he turned down a side path leading toward the woods, supposedly a shortcut back to Oak Ridge Lane. A few kids saw him heading that way. No one thought much of it until it got dark. By 5:30 p.m., when Jacob hadn't arrived home, Rachel started calling around. First Megan, then a few neighbors. Maybe he stopped to play or forgot the time. But by 6, her voice was tight with panic. Megan grabbed her bike and started riding around the neighborhood, calling Jacob's name, checking the park, the schoolyard, the trail behind the church. By 7:15, Rachel called the police. Officers arrived, took a report, and began canvassing the area. Flashlights flickered across yards and fields. Volunteers quickly joined, teachers, neighbors, even strangers. The town rallied. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopters equipped with infrared were requested but delayed due to worsening weather. Around 10 p.m., the skies opened. Heavy rain poured, turning dirt trails into slick mud paths. Searchers pressed on through the storm, refusing to stop. By sunrise, nearly the entire community was awake and looking. Then, just after 6 a.m., an officer spotted something beside an overgrown culvert along Pine Hollow Road, about 3 miles from Jacob's school. It was a backpack, red with a dinosaur keychain clipped to the zipper, neatly placed, not dropped, inside Jacob's sketchbook. His lunch uneaten. A library book, everything dry as if protected. But there were no footprints, no tire tracks, no signs of a struggle, no blood, just silence, an eerie, suffocating silence. News spread fast. Jacob's face was plastered on telephone poles, local TV, and church bulletins. Cedar Lake, a town that hadn't seen a major crime in over a decade, was suddenly gripped by fear. Parents kept their children home. Schools increased security. And through it all, Rachel Monroe waited. Sat at her kitchen table, staring at the door. Megan refused to sleep. She rode her bike in circles around town, refusing to stop looking. The police held daily briefings, but they had few answers. How could a child walk home in daylight and vanish without anyone seeing anything? How could a backpack appear untouched in a location previously searched? The rain had washed away any evidence, and with it the town's sense of safety. Cedar Lake would never be the same again. Who took Jacob, and how did he vanish so completely without a trace? When Jacob Monroe's red dinosaur backpack was discovered beside the culvert off Pine Hollow Road, searchers hoped it would lead to a breakthrough. But what struck investigators wasn't just what they found. It was how it was found. The bag was resting upright against a patch of grass, neatly zipped with no mud, no drag marks, and no debris. It hadn't been there long. The area had been searched the night before. Inside were Jacob's belongings, his beloved sketchbook, pages curled but unspoiled, his uneaten sandwich still wrapped in wax paper, and a chapter book from the school library. All dry, all untouched by rain. It didn't make sense. Police theorized the backpack had been placed there deliberately, possibly to mislead the search effort or as a taunt. If someone had abducted Jacob, they may have returned days later to leave the bag. But why? Over the next 3 days, the search intensified. Dive teams combed local ponds and retention basins. Cadaver dogs were redeployed, circling the culvert area again and again. Helicopters flew low over the woods, and tips began pouring in from across the county. One woman reported seeing a white van parked near the school on the day Jacob disappeared. Another man swore he saw someone dragging something into the trees late at night. But each lead unraveled under scrutiny. Wrong date, mistaken identity, no evidence. Then came a call that changed everything. 5 days after Jacob vanished, a farmer in Byron Township, about 30 miles south of Cedar Lake, was checking his property after heavy rain. A shallow creek ran along the edge of his cornfield, and something bright caught his eye. A small tennis shoe soaked and tangled in weeds. He pulled it free. On the tongue was a name written in permanent marker, Jacob M. Detectives arrived within the hour. Searchers spread out. A mile downstream, beneath a rusted drainage pipe, they made a grim discovery: partial remains tangled in brush and hidden from plain sight. The area was rural and rarely traveled. No one had any reason to be there. DNA testing and dental records confirmed what everyone feared. It was Jacob. The autopsy conducted in Grand Rapids offered little clarity. The body was too decomposed for definitive conclusions, but there were signs of blunt force trauma to the skull. No stab wounds, no gunshots. Toxicology was inconclusive. Investigators couldn't say exactly how or when Jacob died. The town of Cedar Lake fell into mourning. A candlelight vigil was held in the schoolyard. Hundreds gathered with candles and flowers. Megan spoke, barely able to get through her words. Rachel collapsed during the memorial, held up by neighbors who could do nothing but cry with her. Jacob's desk at Hillview Elementary was left untouched. His sketchbook was returned to his mother, the pages damp but still legible. The school painted a mural in his honor, a scene of dinosaurs walking across a sunset horizon, with a little boy in a red coat watching them from a hill. His classmates left paper flowers beneath it for weeks. Police declared a full-scale homicide investigation. The FBI joined the case. The drainage pipe became the new epicenter of the search. But again, no prints, no DNA, no usable evidence. Whoever had taken Jacob had been careful, or lucky, and just like that, the trail went cold. Leads dried up. Tips stopped coming. Rumors swirled, but the case stalled. Even with a body, even with a devastated community demanding answers, no suspect emerged. Why did the investigation stall, even with a body? In the weeks that followed the discovery of Jacob Monroe's remains, Cedar Lake became a town suspended in fear. The heartbreak had been overwhelming, but it was the uncertainty that left the deepest wound. A child had been taken, killed, and left in pieces, and no one knew by whom. Worse, they feared the person responsible might still be living among them. Detectives ramped up their efforts. The Cedar Lake Police Department worked closely with the Michigan State Police and a regional FBI unit specializing in child abductions. They started by canvassing the area within a 10-mile radius of both the culvert and the drainage pipe. House-to-house interviews were conducted. Flyers were distributed. Known sex offenders in the county were questioned and had their DNA collected. All came back negative. Investigators had one faint thread: trace DNA found on the straps of Jacob's backpack. It was too degraded for a full profile, but enough to use in comparative testing. Dozens of samples were taken, but none were a match. Then suspicion turned inward. A school groundskeeper, Ronald Keever, became the center of a brief media storm. He had a criminal history, possession of illegal substances, and an indecent exposure charge from 1992. He worked near the school and had limited interaction with students. Police brought him in for questioning. His alibi was thin. He admitted he sometimes walked through the wooded path Jacob might have taken. But with no physical evidence linking him to the crime and a clean DNA test, he was eventually released. Still, the damage was done. Rumors exploded. Parents speculated on Facebook forums. Some pointed fingers at Jacob's teachers. Others whispered about Rachel Monroe's ex-boyfriend, even though he'd moved out of state years earlier. A few believed a drifter was to blame, someone passing through, someone who would never be caught. The lack of surveillance in 2005 hampered the investigation significantly. Hillview Elementary had no security cameras. There were no traffic cams on the main roads. Cell phones lacked GPS tracking, and most kids Jacob's age didn't even carry them. The only cameras in town were in a grocery store and a gas station. Neither caught anything useful. The FBI released a behavioral profile. They believed the abductor likely knew the area well, had observed Jacob beforehand, and possibly even knew his walking route. The suggestion that Jacob may have trusted his killer sent chills through the community. Parents began to scrutinize neighbors and friends, wondering who had seemed too nice or too quiet. Rachel Monroe, exhausted and grieving, appeared on local news channels pleading for answers. "Someone knows something," she said, her voice cracking. "And if you're protecting them, you're just as guilty." Tensions escalated. Parents pulled their children out of school. After-school programs were canceled. For the first time in decades, Cedar Lake called off Halloween. The once close-knit community began to unravel. Doors that used to remain unlocked were now bolted. Children were no longer allowed to play outside alone. Trust eroded. Fear became part of daily life. As the months passed and the case remained unsolved, funding for the task force began to dry up. By March 2006, only a skeleton crew remained assigned to Jacob's file. New leads stopped coming. Jacob's face slowly disappeared from the news cycle, but his absence remained a constant echo. Every quiet street, every wooded path held shadows now. How does a town recover when the monster may still walk among them? The years after Jacob Monroe's murder passed not with resolution, but with a dull ache. In Cedar Lake, life moved on, but it never returned to what it had been. Children grew up, new families moved in, and the once sensational case slipped from front-page headlines to occasional anniversary blurbs buried deep inside the local paper. Yet for those who had known Jacob, the wound remained fresh, unhealed. Rachel Monroe lasted 3 more years in Cedar Lake. Each drive past Hillview Elementary, each glimpse of the wooded trail where Jacob had last been seen was like tearing open a scab. In 2008, she packed up the house on Oak Ridge Lane and moved to Lansing, hoping distance might dull the pain. It didn't. She changed jobs, worked night shifts at a different hospital, and rarely spoke of her son outside of grief support groups. Megan, who had once dreamed of studying art therapy, dropped out of college after her first year. She found herself drawn into advocacy work for missing and exploited children, speaking at rallies and helping organize search teams for other families. "If Jacob can't be saved," she once told a reporter, "maybe someone else can." Back in Cedar Lake, Jacob's memorial at the school weathered like an old gravestone. The mural of dinosaurs faded. Students who never knew him walked by without a second glance. Only on October 12th each year did a few candles appear beneath it, lit quietly by neighbors who still remembered. Inside the police department, Jacob's case file grew thicker, then dusty. Detectives transferred, retired, or left for larger jurisdictions. Each new team would skim the file, hoping for something missed, but the trail was cold. Evidence boxes sat on metal shelves in the basement, labels curling. Every so often a new tip surfaced. Someone thought they recognized the white van. A new inmate claimed to know the killer, but each lead withered under investigation. In 2010, a fresh review of the evidence yielded nothing. In 2015, a surge in DNA technology gave brief hope. Laboratories tried to extract a full profile from the trace on Jacob's backpack straps, but the sample was too degraded, too mixed with environmental contamination. Another dead end. By the late 2010s, Jacob's story had become a whisper. True crime forums and cold case blogs mentioned him in passing, citing the eerie backpack detail or the mysterious drainage pipe. But without new information, the case sank into obscurity. Rachel stopped doing interviews. Megan stopped visiting Cedar Lake, yet both of them still kept Jacob's photo on their nightstands. Then, in early 2023, something shifted. Michigan's Attorney General announced funding for a new cold case initiative. Grants were awarded to departments across the state to reprocess decades-old evidence using advanced forensic genealogy. Cedar Lake was on the list. Jacob's file, once relegated to the back shelves, was pulled again into the light. A new team of investigators opened the boxes. They took new swabs, ran new tests, and contacted private labs specializing in degraded DNA. This time, the technology was different, able to read far more information from far smaller samples. For the first time in 18 years, there was movement. Not hope yet, but motion. Could technology solve what grief and manpower couldn't? By the spring of 2023, technology had caught up to hope. Inside a sterile lab in Lansing, a forensic genealogy team re-examined the minuscule fragment of DNA, recovered nearly 2 decades earlier from the strap of Jacob Monroe's backpack. This time, the sample wasn't processed with standard CODIS methods. Instead, investigators used SNP profiling, a cutting-edge technique that could analyze hundreds of thousands of genetic markers and compare them to public genealogy databases. The degraded DNA, once considered unusable, finally yielded a viable profile. Within weeks, a distant match popped up in a genealogy database, a third cousin living in Minnesota. The team began building a family tree, tracing connections through generations, marriages, and migration patterns. It was tedious, exacting work, cross-referencing birth records, obituaries, marriage licenses, and public archives. The branches led back to Michigan, then narrowed down to a man who had once lived in Cedar Lake in the early 2000s. His name, Gregory Allen Shaw. Shaw had worked at a self-storage facility just a mile from Hillview Elementary. At the time of Jacob's disappearance, he was in his mid-20s, single, and living in a rented basement apartment nearby. He'd never been on the radar. He wasn't on any sex offender registry. His only criminal charge was a misdemeanor DUI in 2006. In 2009, Shaw moved out of state. He got married in Ohio, took a job in HVAC repair, and seemed to settle into a quiet life. But behind that normalcy, investigators believed, was the answer to an 18-year mystery. The Cold Case Unit, working with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, launched a covert surveillance operation. They didn't want to alert Shaw or risk spooking him into disappearing again. They followed him for a week, noting his habits, routines, and social circle. Then, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Shaw stopped at a gas station outside Dayton. As he left, he tossed a used coffee cup into the trash bin. Within minutes, an undercover officer retrieved it. The cup was rushed to the Michigan lab. The results came in less than 72 hours later. The DNA on the cup was a direct match to the degraded sample on Jacob Monroe's. Backpack investigators secured an arrest warrant immediately. This time they weren't taking any chances. A tactical team moved in quickly and quietly. On a gray April morning, as Gregory Shaw walked across the parking lot of a hardware store carrying a bag of lawn fertilizer, unmarked vehicles surrounded him. He was placed in handcuffs without incident. He didn't ask why. He didn't protest. He simply said, "Okay," and looked down. Back in Cedar Lake, news of the arrest spread like wildfire. For the Monroe family, it was a moment they thought might never come. Rachel wept when detectives called her. Megan fell silent for nearly an hour before whispering, "They found him." But there were still questions. So many questions. How had Shaw known Jacob? Why had he been missed for so long? Did he act alone? Was this his only crime? When Shaw was arraigned in Michigan, he declined to speak. His lawyer issued a standard statement. "My client maintains his innocence. We will challenge the evidence in court." The community held its breath, desperate for answers that still weren't coming. Would Gregory Shaw confess? Or would the truth die behind a lawyer's silence? Gregory Allen Shaw was arrested on a cloudy April morning outside a hardware store in suburban Dayton, Ohio. He wore jeans, a faded hoodie, and carried a bag of lawn fertilizer. He looked like any other middle-aged man preparing for spring chores. But within moments, his quiet world collapsed. Unmarked police vehicles surrounded him. Officers moved fast. Shaw didn't resist. He didn't ask questions. He simply placed his hands in front of him as the cuffs were locked tight. That moment, captured by a gas station camera nearby, would loop for days on news broadcasts across the Midwest. Shaw, now 49, was a father of two, married and active in his Ohio community. He coached Little League, volunteered for church fundraisers, and had no criminal record aside from a nearly forgotten DUI from 2006. His neighbors were stunned. He was friendly, always smiling, one woman told reporters. "He taught my son how to pitch," another said. He was just normal. But Shaw had a secret, a darkness buried beneath years of normalcy. Inside the garage of his suburban home, investigators found a hidden hard drive concealed beneath insulation in the attic. Forensic experts recovered thousands of encrypted files, among them child abuse material, images, and videos dating back over a decade. It wasn't just damning, it was monstrous. He was quickly extradited to Michigan, where charges were filed: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and possession of child sexual abuse material. Prosecutors described the digital evidence as sickening and deeply incriminating. When Rachel Monroe received the call confirming Shaw's arrest and the charges against him, she broke down. Sitting at her kitchen table in Lansing, she clutched the last drawing Jacob had made, a stegosaurus with big eyes and a smiling mouth. "I've waited 18 years for this name," she told the press through tears. "Now I just want to know why." Cedar Lake erupted in emotion. The same streets that had once been plastered with missing posters were now swarmed by news vans. Reporters stood outside Hillview Elementary. Old classmates of Jacob's, now adults, posted tributes online. The town held a vigil at the school mural, this time not in mourning but in long-awaited pursuit of justice. But beneath the relief, Unease remained. Shaw had lived and worked among them. He was not a transient. He was not a stranger from out of town. He had worked at a storage facility less than a mile from Jacob's school. He likely crossed paths with the boy multiple times, but investigators found no direct evidence the two had spoken. No witness placing them together, no prior incidents reported. The biggest question loomed: why Jacob? The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit posited that Shaw may have acted on impulse, possibly after observing Jacob's routine. Some theorized he had been watching the school for weeks. Others wondered if Jacob had been lured. But without a confession, all remained speculation. More chilling still was the possibility that Shaw hadn't acted alone, or hadn't acted only once. The digital forensics team continued to comb through Shaw's files, seeking any sign of other victims. The scope of what they found, while not fully disclosed, was enough to suggest years of predatory behavior. Rachel, Megan, and the people of Cedar Lake wanted answers. Not just justice for Jacob, but the truth. And now, as the court process prepared to begin, the weight of that truth would fall into the hands of a jury. Would a courtroom deliver justice, or more questions? The trial of Gregory Allen Shaw began in early February 2024 at the Kent County Courthouse. Snow fell softly outside as the nation turned its attention to a courtroom that had waited nearly 2 decades for answers. Inside, the tension was palpable. Rows of reporters lined the back benches. Rachel Monroe sat quietly in the front row, flanked by Megan and a small group of victims' advocates. In her hands, she clutched Jacob's old sketchbook, now faded with time. Shaw entered the courtroom wearing a gray suit and shackles. He showed no emotion. He avoided Rachel's eyes. From the start, he pled not guilty to all charges. Prosecutors wasted no time. They laid out a methodical, chilling timeline of events: surveillance logs, DNA findings, digital forensics. They walked the jury through the story of Jacob's disappearance, the discovery of his backpack, the years of silence, and the eventual DNA match pulled from a discarded coffee cup in Ohio. A forensic genealogist explained how SNP profiling had narrowed the suspect pool to Shaw's family tree. The match, they said, was no coincidence. Witnesses took the stand, former co-workers who recalled seeing Shaw near Hillview Elementary in 2005. One man remembered a white van, matching Shaw's being parked along Pine Hollow Road. Another described how Shaw quit his storage job abruptly days after Jacob disappeared. Rachel Monroe's testimony was quiet but searing. She described her son's final morning: the red windbreaker, his peanut butter sandwich. The moment she realized he was gone, her hands shook as she held up the sketchbook and pointed to the final drawing, a smiling T-Rex in red pencil. This was the last thing Jacob made, she said. He never got to finish it. Then came the digital evidence. Experts testified about the hidden hard drive found in Shaw's attic. Thousands of encrypted files, many of them graphic, disturbing, and dated back more than a decade. Several files had been accessed shortly after Jacob's disappearance. Prosecutors argued that Shaw had not only abducted and killed Jacob, but had likely abused others, though no other victims had been confirmed. The defense pushed back. They challenged the integrity of the DNA chain of custody. They questioned how long the backpack had been exposed to the elements. They insisted the connection between Shaw and Jacob was circumstantial. No direct witnesses, no confession, no surveillance footage. They painted Shaw as a reformed man, a father and community member, undeserving of life in prison for what they called coincidental evidence. But the jury saw through it. After 3 weeks of testimony and 4 days of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Gregory Allen Shaw was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and grief. Rachel sobbed quietly. Megan clung to her shoulder. Reporters rushed outside to broadcast the verdict. Cedar Lake let out a collective breath. But even as the gavel fell, questions lingered in the air like smoke. Why Jacob? Was he targeted or simply at the wrong place at the wrong time? Was Shaw's crime impulsive, or had he been watching children for years? And the most chilling of all, had he done this before? As Rachel walked out of the courtroom into the gray Michigan afternoon, she held Jacob's sketchbook tightly against her chest. The weight of justice was heavy, but it could never fill the space Jacob once held. What becomes of a legacy forged in tragedy? Jacob Eli Monroe never made it to 4th grade. He never got to build that papier-mâché volcano he had planned with his sister, or read his dinosaur book aloud to the younger kids in the library. His desk at Hillview Elementary remained empty long after his memorial. But Jacob's story didn't end in the drainage pipe where his remains were found. In many ways, that's where it truly began. Following the conviction of Gregory Allen Shaw, there was a surge of momentum across Michigan, an urgency to make sure what happened to Jacob would never be repeated. And if it was, that law enforcement would have better tools to respond. Lawmakers in Lansing introduced legislation known as Jacob's Law, aimed at reforming how cold cases are processed and funded. It included measures to expand the state's use of forensic genealogy, increase resources for cold case units, and create a statewide DNA backlog audit. Within months, Jacob's Law passed unanimously. It marked the first time Michigan had officially committed budgetary funding for advanced DNA technologies like SNP profiling and familial database access. In press conferences, state senators referenced Jacob by name, calling his case a turning point in the way justice is pursued. Rachel Monroe, once too broken to speak, found a new voice in her grief. She founded a nonprofit called Sketches of Hope, named after Jacob's dinosaur drawings. The organization provides emotional support, legal guidance, and DNA testing grants to families of missing children and unsolved homicide victims. Rachel began speaking publicly again, at schools, police departments, and conferences, sharing Jacob's story not as an end but as a mission. "I couldn't save my son," she told one crowd. "But maybe another mother won't have to bury hers if we do this right." Her message resonated. Back in Cedar Lake, the community began to heal in small, lasting ways. Hillview Elementary unveiled a new mural on the side of its library, Jacob smiling and holding a book surrounded by a parade of dinosaurs, a stegosaurus, a T-Rex, a triceratops. The artist was a local teacher who had once taught Jacob in 2nd grade. She called it "The Boy Who Imagined a Better World." Each October, on the anniversary of his disappearance, students place paper fossils and hand-drawn dinosaurs at the base of the mural. They learn about Jacob not as a victim but as a symbol of hope, courage, and justice. Cedar Lake itself underwent change. New security protocols were implemented in schools. Neighborhood watch programs were revitalized. And more importantly, people began to speak more openly about the importance of vigilance, support, and not letting cases like Jacob's fade into silence. Megan Monroe, now in her early 30s, became a national speaker and advocate. She continues her work with Sketches of Hope and contributes to several federal panels on missing children. She carries Jacob's last sketch, his smiling red-penciled T-Rex, in her wallet. "He's still protecting me," she says, just in a different way. For Rachel, for Megan, and for all who loved Jacob, justice didn't erase the pain, but it brought meaning to the years of agony. In life, Jacob had been a quiet, creative child. In death, he became the spark for something larger, change. What if every cold case had a second chance? In 2005, Michigan lost more than just a little boy. It lost a dreamer, a 3rd grader with a quiet voice and a wild imagination, a child who carried a sketchbook filled with dinosaurs and hope. Jacob Eli Monroe disappeared on an ordinary afternoon, and for 18 years that ordinary day remained frozen in the hearts of those who loved him. His case went cold, like so many others. Evidence degraded, leads dried up. His name faded from headlines, and yet his family never stopped hoping. His community never fully stopped searching. In the end, it was science that opened the locked door. Forensic genealogy, a distant DNA match, a coffee cup thrown away by a man who thought he'd escaped justice. Gregory Allen Shaw's arrest didn't just close a case, it reopened a community's soul. His conviction didn't erase the pain, but it brought clarity. It gave Rachel Monroe, Jacob's mother, a name to curse. It gave Megan, his sister, a mission to fight for. And it gave Michigan a reason to change the law, to better fund cold case units, to give every family the tool they need to fight the darkness. Jacob never made it to 4th grade, but his life has reached farther than anyone could have imagined. A mural now watches over the school where he once played. Children draw dinosaurs in his honor. His name is spoken in courtrooms and at rallies. His memory has become a force for good. Jacob's story reminds us, silence isn't closure. Time doesn't erase truth, and no case should ever be forgotten. If you watched to the end, comment "Justice for Jacob" below, and share this video to keep his legacy alive. Because for every cold case, there's a family still waiting.